Anyway, good morning. My name is Adam Posen of the Peterson Institute for International Economics and the Bank of England. Today I'm here solely as Peterson Institute, nothing to do with Bank of England. It's my privilege and honor to chair the first session, which is on monetary policy. As the managing director just set out, and as I think most of us would agree, there was a very strong feeling that monetary policy had in some ways solved its neck of the woods a few years ago. And not only that, that perhaps many of the other good things that were happening could have been attributed to monetary policy. And now we find ourselves with perhaps the reverse reaction, which is monetary policy may not have solved its own bailiwick, and it's being blamed for things that maybe have nothing to do with monetary policy. We have today perhaps the best possible panel of people at the nexus of scholarship and practice to help us think this through. They don't need introduction, but this is going out to the world. We hope that many people outside these hallowed halls will read and watch this, so I'm going to introduce our panelists anyway. In alphabetical order, Olivier Blanchard, one of the co-organizers of the conference, the director of research here at the fund, the Economic Council, and of course, the person from whom most of my generation learned our sensible macroeconomics. I respect these gentlemen. We're going to stick very tightly to time because we want each person to have their say. Each is going to be given 15 minutes, and then they're each going to get 1 or 2 minutes to respond if there's a key point they need to respond to. Then we'll open it up to the floor. Please, Olivier, if you could start. This conference is totally on the record, so think before you speak.
Good morning. I have organized my discussion around 5 slides, but I thought I would probably start with the bottom line, which is that before the crisis, we had converged on a beautiful construction in terms of monetary policy. That was basically, we had convinced ourselves that at least this is convergence of the mainstream economists and many policymakers. There was one target, inflation. There was one instrument, which was the policy rate, the short rate, or policy rate rule, and that was enough to basically do things. I think if there is one lesson from the crisis, it has already been said both by Dominique Strauss-Kahn and by Adam, is that that wasn't right. That beauty is not synonymous with truth, and that we have to basically reconsider. And I think the truth is, unfortunately, that there are many targets and there are many instruments, and how you map the instruments into the targets and how you use them best is a very complex process, and that monetary policy is likely to be rather complicated and messy relative to the simple picture which we had constructed earlier. So with this, let me just go through the argument in a bit more detail. This is, I think, a bit of a caricature, but not much, of the way monetary policy was seen, at least in advanced countries, before the crisis. There was one target, which was stable inflation. There was one instrument, which was the policy rate, and that was basically enough. If you had the right policy rate rule, you would achieve low, stable inflation, you would achieve credibility, and you would achieve a stable economy. And there was this implicit assumption that the focus could be on stable inflation because the stable inflation would deliver economic stability in a larger sense, basically in the sense of a stable output gap. This was the case in formal academic models, where there was this thing that Jordi Galli and I have called the divine coincidence, which is that in these models, if you actually were able to maintain stable inflation, you would actually maintain a stable output gap, so there was really no reason to look at the output gap separately. I think realism on the part of many central bankers made them realize that this was a bit of an extreme proposition, and in fact, there could be, at least in the short run, some deviation, and you had to worry about the output gap, and that led to something called flexible inflation targeting, in which you would allow for some deviations in order to stabilize what you thought was the output gap. Now, we come to the post-crisis tentative consensus, and this is one version of it, and then I'll go through another one. We learned, I think, two main things from the crisis. One is something that we all understand extremely well, which is that you can have stable inflation, you can have a stable output gap, at least it looks stable, but things are not going well behind the scene. There are things happening in the economy and you don't have financial stability. And then eventually financial stability translates into major problems in terms of output and activity. And so I think there's a general consensus now that to the list of targets you have stable inflation on one side, and then you have this other one, which is stable financial stability. And that really is part and parcel of what monetary policy in a broader sense has to be about. I think there is also the agreement that the debate which existed pre-crisis, that whether you should use the policy rate to try to achieve not only stable inflation but also financial stability, was not the right one. That basically there's a whole set of instruments out there. That's a point that Dominique has made as well. And so I think the picture which has emerged in the mind of many, and I think many central banks, is you now have this division between two. On one side, monetary policy has to take care of inflation and using the policy rate, and on the other side, the monetary policy also has a second task, which is to worry about financial stability and has to use a set of instruments, which are the macroprudential instruments. There's, I think, another dimension in which the crisis has led to a change from the previous slide, and that's the unequal question mark sign that I've put here. I think the notion that stable inflation basically implies a stable output gap is also a notion that many are questioning. Again, in some of our models, it works very well. There's a fairly tight relation between the movement of inflation, however defined, and the output gap. But in reality, we seem to see very divergent paths of inflation and what we think is the output gap. And that's a difficult question because the output gap is not observable. And so the question that inflation stability delivers a stable output gap is also something which is much more questioned, in which case the central banks really have no choice than to look at both and have a more flexible approach to how they handle both. I think I was at a conference attended by many central bankers 2 days ago, and I got the sense that the emerging consensus among central banks, not necessarily among academics, was that this was the way to proceed. And in a way, you could still, I think they were more skeptical than I about the question mark here, that there was a sense in which you could basically do monetary policy more or less the same way with respect to stable inflation, still basically use a policy rule, but this was only half of the job. Then there was another job, which was financial stability, in which you use macroprudential tools. But these were largely separate, or could be kept largely separate. Maybe you could have an institution doing one and another institution doing the other one. Clearly, there had to be some interaction between the two, but the two could be largely separated. So there was some repairs to be done on the left. There was creation of something new on the right. But this was the way the mandate of a central bank could be extended. I'm not absolutely sure that that's actually the way monetary policy should be thought about. That's too neat a view because you basically have interactions going both ways. You have first the mapping from macroprudential to stable financial is a very complex one. It's not as if we have one set of instruments and one clear goal, systemic risk or something like this. I think macroprudential has to be about many aspects of the financial system, and the notion that we're going to find one sufficient statistic called systemic risk which we can then target, I think, is an illusion. We're going to have to look all the time at the balance sheets of the various financial institutions. So you have many arrows rather than just one. And then you have interactions, very strong interactions, from what traditional monetary policy is, namely the movement in the policy rate to financial stability. And that's the discussion, for example, about low interest rate leading to risk-taking or excess leverage, which is clearly an arrow going this way. And then every macroprudential instrument is likely to affect the macroeconomy in some way. And these are the arrows starting from the right and then going left back to stable inflation or stable output. I think that's where this is the way to think about things. It is much less neat than the previous slide, but I think we have to think about monetary policy in a broad sense as having many targets, two or three there, and having many instruments with some allocation of instruments, but realizing that most instruments are going to affect all three targets in some way. Now, this being said, I think this shows the size of the challenge, which is that we all talk about macroprudential, but how these macroprudential tools can be used is something we know relatively little about. We talk about moving the loan-to-value ratio, but whether it can actually affect housing prices, housing investment in a reliable way remains very much to be worked out, and that's true of many of the other macroprudential instruments. So there's an enormous amount of work to do. The second is the political economy issues, which is that as long as the central bank was conceptually just in charge of the policy rate, this looked fairly neutral with respect to sectors and particular groups, and it could ask for independence and obtain it. When it starts being in charge of many instruments, nearly all of them having an effect on a specific segment of the economy in a very particular way, then the question of independence comes up. The question of whether, I think you have to have one authority in the end because of these interactions, but how much independence you give to it is an open question. And then the last one is realism, in the sense that, I mean, this in some way may describe what was done in the 1950s, in which there were all kinds of ways of intervening and putting restrictions, regulation, queue in the US, and the list is a long one. And the danger here is that we go back to a very complex set of instruments with many distortions which we had not thought about and come into play. So I think this is the challenge. But I think we have to accept the fact that monetary policy should probably be thought of in that form. The last two slides are about monetary policy in emerging market countries. And there the issues are a bit different. And here what I want to focus on is the role of the exchange rate, which is less important, I think, for advanced economies where you have nearly perfect capital mobility. Many emerging market countries had decided to move and had moved to inflation targeting. The most advanced emerging market countries were emphatic about adopting inflation targeting. And so they were using the same framework, which is using the policy rate in order to affect inflation and assuming the output gap was, as a result, be stable. The exchange rate was, at least in the official discourse, left aside. They basically described themselves as floaters. They argued that they cared about the exchange rate only to the extent that it affected inflation. And so as part of inflation targeting, they took into account the effect of the exchange rate on inflation. But there was no further weight put on the exchange rate as a target. I think these were the words. The deeds, in many cases, were actually quite different. And they clearly cared about the exchange rate beyond just its effect on inflation. And it is my sense that in this case, the deeds were different from the words, and what was right was the deeds and not the words. But the result was a rather confused policy in which the pretense was we don't care about the exchange rate, and in fact, they care. I think they should care about the exchange rate, and this leads me to my last slide. Right. Which is, I think this is the way that in many emerging market countries where there is imperfect capital mobility, monetary policy should be thought about, which is that there should be the usual targets of stable inflation and stable output gap, but there should also be a target related to the exchange rate. maybe slowing down movements in the exchange rate and so on. And here again, we should not think of one tool as being able to do everything, which it can't, but we should think of two tools. The first one is the usual policy rate, and the other is sterilized intervention, something which works but there is imperfect capital mobility. And I think that making this framework explicit and seeing how you use each instrument in order to basically achieve the best outcome in terms of a set of targets is something which would be very useful to think about. Again, I think it is implicitly done by many countries, but the rhetoric is quite different. I think sitting down and thinking about how it can be done explicitly, credibly, while maintaining low inflation and perhaps smoothing out movements in exchange rates is something which would be tremendously useful to do. The general point here is again that in the end we've moved from this one instrument, one target world to a world in which there are clearly many targets and there are many instruments, and we're just starting to explore how we go from one set to the other. That's going to be a long and difficult process.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Olivier. If you could hand the PowerPoint baton to Otmar, we'll call on him